definitely keep you in prayer. Can you fire them? And I would make it known probably in advance that, hey, this is a birthmark, it's not a bruise, before you get started. Okay. Brent, would you mind leading us in prayer and keeping Chrissy in our prayers for all the issues she has, from sepsis to all kinds of stuff going on? And also Laura and Bob giving thanks for the blessings, and Anne and her situation with her mom and the company. Okay, our next lessons that we're going through in our series is on the holiness of God, and then we get into the priesthoods. And as I mentioned last week, when we were on vacation, we had the opportunity to listen to Leviticus while we were traveling, and there was just nothing but bare land, northern Texas and across Kansas and eastern Colorado. So Mike Maslongo has done a really good job. I feel that he's done on the holiness of God, and the first two lessons in Leviticus that he's done really kind of follows right along with the lesson that I had planned. And the second lesson is printing. I had a kerfuffle with my printer, and it wanted to print the whole page about 2/3 of the way up, and I could not figure out how to get it to print centered on the page out of PDF file. So either I get a new printer at home, or I do what I did this morning. I brought the second lesson in, and it's being copied. So we'll pass that out here shortly. So anyway, we're picking up. We may cross over a little bit um, because we didn't mark exact time last week where we finished up at. So I have Stephen go ahead and start the video from last week, and we'll go through that. And then if time permits, we'll do the second lesson. It's quite a bit shorter than the first one, so go ahead and start that, Steve. Appreciate it.
The ultimate goal of holiness is not that we become holier than thou. You know what that means, right? Holier than thou. That's not the goal of holiness. The goal of holiness is that we love God appropriately and that we love our neighbor as God would have us to love our neighbor. That's the goal of the holy lifestyle. Leviticus helps us to understand how God trained his people to get to this point. All right, let's talk about the outlines. The first outline is from the Harper Study Bible. It's the shortest of the outlines, 2 parts. First part, the way of approach to a holy God, Leviticus 1 to 16. Part 2, maintaining fellowship with a holy God, Leviticus 17 to 27. That's a kind of easy way to remember this book. Half of it is, Outline number 2 is the opposite. It's the expanded outline. It has all the details. Outline number 2 has 4 main parts, and each part is broken down. So the 4 main parts are the offerings, the general regulations and the priestly regulations about the offering of animals, so on and so forth. Second part, the priesthood, how the priests themselves were prepared for their work and how they were installed into service. The third part, cleanliness and uncleanliness. In other words, the regulations that distinguish between clean and unclean, what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. And of course, information about the Day of Atonement, the high day in the calendar, the religious calendar of the Jews. And then the fourth section, the Holiness Code, chapter 17 to 27. And here we have 8 parts: the sanctity of blood, the moral laws, the priestly regulations, the worship calendar. The Jews had a regular calendar and they had a sacred calendar, and we'll study the various festivals that fit in the worship calendar. Oil, bread, and blasphemy, rules about these things. The Sabbath year and Jubilee, fascinating ordinances for the Jews to follow. Various rewards and punishment, and vows and tithes spoken of at the end. Again, the theme of the book of Leviticus is centered on holiness, so the outline that we will use for our study will be one that follows the general theme. And here it is, outline number 3, training for holiness. This outline has 2 parts. First part, attaining holiness, chapters 1 to 16. Attaining holiness through offerings, through a consecrated priesthood, by distinguishing between clean and unclean, and by observing the Day of Atonement. There you go, attaining holiness. And then the second part, practicing holiness, 17 to 27. This here has individual responsibility to keep God's moral and ritual laws. We learn about that. The priestly responsibilities for the priest to function properly as God's representative. The nation's responsibility to promote holiness. We see these in the keeping of the various festivals, and I'll explain to you each of the festivals they had to keep and the purpose for them, and so on and so forth. Reasons for practicing holiness. The book explains to us, why should we make the attempt to follow these commands in order to be holy? Why? What's in it for us? And the answer is very clear. Blessings. God names all the blessings that come with those who are practicing holiness, and the curses that come for those who neglect these practices. And then finally, evidence of holiness, and those are the vows and the valuations. Of course, this is just a general framework for the material contained in the book of Leviticus. The outline is a tool to help us know what we're talking about and where we are when we begin adding detail to our study, because it's easy to get lost in the weeds. There's so many details. So every once in a while, we're going to back up. We're going to put our all of the verses, but we won't read all of them. If you read ahead, you'll be familiar with what I'm. That's our first lesson. Next time, we're going to examine more closely this idea of holiness, collective holiness of the text. So I thank you for being with us today. I look forward to seeing you next time. Remind you about getting that workbook. It'll make this course much more easy to follow. God bless you. We'll see you.
I said before we continue with the second video, is there any comments? Yeah, Vernon?
Our Leviticus for Beginners is the class, Training for Holiness, subheading of our
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the 2 rituals and the 5 practices until he put it in that context in this video, and I really appreciated that as well. And that's lays it out there, and it's pretty plain, and it's pretty simple and down to earth, and can understand it really well. So in essence of time, if there's not any other comments, we'll start in on a second video. And I think these 2 videos kind of summarize where we've been in our lessons and kind of where we're going. So the next, like I said, the next one is talking about the priesthood and the feasts and the festivals. Glenn got into a little bit of that during the tabernacle study a little bit. We're going to delve in just a little bit deeper into that as well.
Here we are. Leviticus for Beginners is the class, Training for Holiness, subheading of our class. We're in lesson number 2, and the title for today's lesson is Holy People Then and Now. So in our introductory lesson, we reviewed the basic questions asked concerning any book of the Bible that we would choose to study. For example, things like who wrote the Bible, not the Bible, but who wrote the particular book, when was it written, what is it about, is there a theme, how is it divided? That's usually the first lesson in the study of any Bible book. We also looked at the Pentateuch, or the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, written, we believe, by Moses, and of which the book of Leviticus is the 3rd book in that series. As the subtitle of this study on Leviticus suggests, we understand that the theme of the book is holiness, and that this book, Moses spells out in specific terms what God required of the people, the Israelites, in order to be considered the holy people of God. Of course, as he said, I am holy, therefore you shall be holy. Well, what does it take to be holy? And the book of Leviticus answers that question. So in this lesson, we're going to compare the demands of holiness then in the Old Testament and the demands of holiness now in the New Testament, and review some of the reasons why we should study the book of Leviticus and note the different ways that holiness, or rather different ways to holiness, that God has provided then and now. And so all of this preparatory material will really give us some background and some stickiness, if you wish, so that the ideas presented when we get to the text of Leviticus will make some sense to us immediately. We'll be able to put it in some sort of context. All right, so holy people then and now. This idea of a holy people first appears in the book of Exodus when God offers the descendants of Abraham a new covenant. Up until that time, Exodus 19, 5 and 6, when Moses and the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai and they camped before the mountain. This was about 3 months after their departure from Egypt. During the time starting with Moses' call by God at the burning bush, through the 10 plagues and the people's freedom from Egyptian slavery, the crossing of the Red Sea and the destruction of the Egyptian army, all the way to the people receiving water and food miraculously while they were in the wilderness, all during this time, God was in the process of fulfilling his first and original covenant made with Abraham and renewed through Isaac and Jacob. And so that first covenant was the promise to give the descendants of Abraham the land of Canaan as their own land, and also to multiply his descendants, and from them would come one who would bless all the families of the earth. And we understand that to be the Messiah. We read about that in Genesis 12, 1 to 3, and again in Genesis 17, 1 to 8. Now, the second part of that covenant was fulfilled when Jacob and his family took refuge in Egypt under the protection of his son Joseph, who had become second to the Pharaoh during the great famine. And we know that story told in Genesis. You know, Joseph sold into slavery into Egypt and ultimately becoming second in command to the Pharaoh. And ultimately his brothers, come from the land of Canaan to get food, and they ultimately learn of his true identity. He invites the whole family, including his father Jacob, to come and settle in the land of Goshen, where they will be taken care of, and they begin to live there in Goshen. And so from the original 70 people who came with Jacob, over the next 400 years, the Israelites grew to a population of about 2 million people at the time of the Exodus. Read about that in Numbers 11, verse 21. And so this fulfilled the second promise of the first covenant, where God said to Abraham, I will multiply you greatly. I'll give you the land of Canaan, the promised land, and I'll multiply you greatly. All right? What we read about in the book of Exodus is God fulfilling the first promise to Abraham, which was that he would give them the land of Canaan, or the promised land. Exodus describes the beginning of that journey that will eventually see the Israelites, after 40 years of wilderness wanderings, finally enter and take possession of the promised land as described in the book of Joshua. Okay, so the first two promises of the covenant with Abraham, and I put in brackets, which were ratified by circumcision. In other words, all those who were part of that promise were circumcised. And so the first two promises of that covenant, ratified by circumcision, number one, receiving the land of Canaan as their own, and two, multiplying their numbers, that was being fulfilled. The third part of the covenant, that the families of the earth blessed would be fulfilled 1,500 years later, as Jesus was born from a tiny remnant of the Jews still living and under Roman bondage on a small strip of land in Judea, in Galilee. a small strip of land about 145 miles long and maybe 50 miles wide at its, widest. And so, they started with 2 million people. They controlled all of the land. But by the time Jesus arrived, they had been reduced in number. They were living under the yoke of Roman oppression. They had no real political or military power. They were reduced in size. Even the land that they had originally inherited, had originally been given to them by God, had shrunk, it was only a small piece of land that they had. Nevertheless, God had preserved that remnant in order to fulfill the third part of his promise, and that was to send the Messiah, the one who would bless all of the nations. So while this covenant was being fulfilled, God established a second covenant with the Israelites, which was more demanding of the Jews, but offered greater physical and spiritual blessings. So let's read about that in Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 and 2. In the third month, after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." And so the great difference between these two covenants was the issue of holiness, which the people were now going to make as a central part of their relationship with God. Obedient faith being the substance of the first, and an attempt or, the exercise of practicing holiness and maintaining holiness was the central idea of the second. So God's holy people then and now, let's talk about this holiness idea. The actual meaning of the word holy, kadosh, in the Hebrew, means separate or set apart or sacred. It has a highly religious connotation, in that it was not a common word used in everyday language, everyday conversation, but it was put into use for religious purposes and was a word used from the earliest times in religious context. For example, the first time it was used was in Exodus chapter 3, verse 5, where God said to Moses from the burning bush that he was standing on holy ground. And from that point on, the term holiness took on more and more significance. In one sense, the word describes an object or a place or a day which is to be considered holy, meaning the day will be devoted or dedicated to a particular purpose. Holiness, as I've said before, is the main theme of the book of Leviticus. The word holy appears 90 times and is used in 76 verses of the New American Standard Bible's version of the book of Leviticus. The following is a list of what and who are described as being holy in Leviticus. For example, the Lord God of Israel, his name and how he is treated is holy. And in prayers and praise, the people would say, "Holy, holy, holy are you, God in heaven." And so the people associated holiness with God in Leviticus 11, 44 and 45, Leviticus chapter 20, as well as chapter 10. Also, the people of God, they are holy. Not only God is holy, but the people of God are termed as holy in Leviticus 11, 44 and chapter 45, verse 45 and chapter 19, verse 2. The tabernacle and the complex and all the elements in the tabernacle is considered as being holy. Leviticus 16, verse 12. The priests and even the garments that the priests wore, these were holy. Leviticus 8, 9, 16, 4, and 21, verse 6. The sacrifices that were offered at the tabernacle, these also were considered as being holy. Leviticus 14, 13. The feasts that they observed throughout the year were holy. Leviticus 23, verse 2. And that which was given or offered to God, whatever that was holy. Leviticus 19 and also Leviticus 27, verse 9. And so both the priests and the people had to make the distinction between the holy and the profane. In other words, they had to treat these things differently. Some things were holy and some were profane, meaning they were ordinary, they were common, as well as things that were clean and unclean in the life and in the worship of God's people, a holy nation of God. And a big part of their life and a big part of their practice was to distinguish between what was clean and unclean, what was holy and what was unholy. In practical terms, however, being a holy nation required the Israelites to be holy or separate in two particular ways. First, they needed to be separated from other nations. So being a holy nation meant that they didn't mix with other nations. In other words, they didn't intermarry, they didn't interworship. They were separate from they kept themselves separate from other nations. That was one of the requirements for becoming holy. And also, they had to be separated for God's use. They weren't just separated for the sake of being separated. They were separated in order to be exclusively used by God for His purposes. So let's look at those two ideas, separated from other nations. We read in Leviticus 11, 44 and 5, it says, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy." And so God did not free the Israelites from Egyptian bondage simply as an act of mercy for an oppressed people. He didn't do it because He pitied them. Delivering them to the promised land so that they could live freely and plentifully as a free nation on their own land. Again, this was not a final end unto itself. This was not a final goal. It was a means to an end, but it wasn't the end itself. God had a higher spiritual purpose for the Israelites, and that was that they would become His people and thus a holy nation. And in order for that to happen, they needed to be freed from bondage, and they needed to live in their own land. Yes, they needed a place to live and land to support their physical needs, but this was secondary in service to their primary role and associated tasks that came with being the people of God, a holy nation among all the nations around them. So God freed them, yes, and God gave them the promised land yet, but there was an ulterior motive for that, and that was so that He could train and teach them to be the holy people of God and worship Him as the holy people of God. And that was much easier to do in their own land that they controlled, the land that gave them sustenance and so on and so forth. So we read in Leviticus 18, verse 30, "Thus you are to keep my charge, that you do not practice any of the abominable customs which have been practiced before you, so as not to defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God." So here he's talking about mingling with the other nations. You won't do that, he says. You won't copy the things that they do. You won't defile yourself. You won't dirty yourselves. You won't, become unholy by practicing the things that these other nations practice. That's why you need to keep yourself separate from them. And then in verse 9 it says, "When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations." The same idea, but much more specific. The things that the nations did will be actually described in the various prohibitions that God gives them, that they shouldn't do, that they shouldn't practice. He goes into detail. Here it's only mentioned, in a general sense. If you want to be my people, a holy people, you won't associate and mingle with the nations around you, and you will not copy their practices. And so being God's people, a holy nation, required them to avoid the common practices of the unholy nations that came before them and surrounded them now. And as we will read, they had to begin to practice the lifestyle and worship of a holy nation that God, through Moses, would now give them. Being a holy nation required that the Israelites make no arrangements or compromise with the nations around them in order to secure peaceful relations. They weren't to give in to various worship practices and to various practices or habits in order to keep the peace. God sent them into the promised land, and the way to deal with the nations there was to wipe them out. Because if they compromised, this would invariably lead to intermarriage and eventually the introduction of pagan gods and worships and pagan practices. Compromise was Satan's most effective strategy in his effort to destroy God's people and ruin their holy status. It wasn't that they, when you read through this, you see it over and over again. It wasn't that they totally rejected God. It wasn't that they said, okay, we're done with God. It's too much work, this holy business. We just want a simple life. We want him. No, they didn't say that. No, the danger was that they would continue to worship God, continue to practice the things that he had given them through Moses, but at the same time start bringing in practices and rituals and gods, and various elements of worship that came from other nations and other religions. And usually that happened through intermarriage. A man would take a wife from the Canaanites, and she would bring her gods and her father's gods and her sister's gods and so on and so forth. And so in doing so, they would eventually fail the first test of holiness, which was to keep themselves separate from other nations and the worship of other gods. The other requirement of being God's holy nation or God's people is that they were separated for a purpose. Being separated from other nations, again, wasn't a goal in itself. It was a means to a goal. It was the means to keep themselves pure. Why? Because God had a use for them. God had a purpose for them if they remained his people. And so the first aspect of holiness is what you won't do or what you'll stop doing. And in their case, mixing with unholy pagan people and practicing pagan ways in worship. The second aspect of holiness is what you will do as a holy nation and people of God. and that is to follow and obey God's commands and his instructions for holy living. God is the one who dictates what is holy. We're not the ones that say, oh, this is holy or that is holy. No, God is the one that does that. He is the one that says this is clean and this is not clean, not us. For example, there's nothing innately better than, destroying a sheep by burning it, with fire, as a sacrifice, or killing a mule by slitting its throat. In both cases, what have you done? You've killed an animal, different types of animals. You've killed two different animals in two different ways. And so both are simply different ways of killing different animals. Nothing better or worse in either of the ways. However, killing a sheep and then burning it by fire becomes a holy act of devotion to God when God himself gives instructions to do so in the process of worshiping him. Now killing that sheep and offering it on the altar and so on and so forth as a response to the instructions given to us by God, now that becomes a holy thing. It eliminates all other things. In other words, it's not a donkey that he wants. It's not by slitting the donkey's throat. He didn't ask for that. We do what God tells us, not what he doesn't tell us. All right? Saying something or action or person becomes holy only when God deems it or him or her as such. That's the essence of holiness. God separating or instructing a particular thing or action or person for his own purpose and use. That's what makes that thing, that action, or that person holy. God is the one that sets it aside for that.
There's kind of a division. He talks about the Old Testament and what's expected to be holy, and then he looks at the New Testament and what's expected to be holy. And our practices today in our religious worship and our acts of service to the Lord, he's going to look at that, and we'll pick up where we left off here. Stephen, if you'd note where we're at minute-wise on the video, we'll pick up here next week and then finish up with kind of a summary and go over any questions you have. I hope that you're picking up some things in here that maybe you hadn't really thought about in reference to holiness, especially to what God's asked us to do and what he has not asked us to do, and the obedience that we give to him makes us holy. It's not necessarily the acts, but the obedience and following his will and what he's told us to do. And he does get pretty specific in Leviticus about, if you don't do this, these are the punishments that the Israelites will get. So if you have an opportunity this week and you want to delve in a little bit deeper, I would recommend reading as far as you can into Leviticus. He recommended the first 10 chapters off of the first video, and so there's a lot of information in there, like he said, and we're not going to be able to cover it all in a couple of lessons, but I will go through a lot of what's in the book of Leviticus as we go along. I appreciate your time this morning, and I hope this was valuable for you. Thanks.